Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our Tuesday episode of the Rural Rapport. I'm really happy to have you with us today. We have a special guest, Audrey Lomax from Minnesota Native Landscapes, and we are going to be talking about solar grazing today. Just as an introduction, if you haven't followed us before, we are from the Center for Rural Affairs. And the center is a nonprofit organization established in 1973 in Northeast Nebraska. We've now expanded out. We have staff located in Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and South Dakota. I am a policy associate with the center, and I'm based in southeastern South Dakota. The center's mission is to establish strong rural communities, social and economic justice, environmental stewardship, and create opportunity for all while engaging in decisions that affect the quality of their lives and future of their communities. So our big topic today is solar grazing. And as solar expands across the nation, this vegetation management tool at the sites has emerged as a new topic. And we have Audrey here today. She is something of an expert on the topic and is engaged in this through her work. So Audrey joins us from Minnesota Native Landscapes, and she is the Sustainable Agriculture Program Manager, and she manages the grazing program. So Audrey, tell us a little bit more about your role at Minnesota Native Landscapes.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. My role at Minnesota Native Landscape, now known as MNL, is that I do manage the Sustainable Agriculture Program, which right now consists of predominantly restoration grazing. We graze solar sites with sheep and we graze woodlands with goats to kind of manage invasive species. Of course, today we're here to talk about the sheep on solar sites. And for that, my main function is anything from sales and working on the initial seeding plan to incorporate grazing, to outreach, and then planning the actual operations of making sure the animals are getting around to the right sites at the right time, and that the people know what they need to be doing to make that happen.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what solar grazing is. So we are always looking at, the impact of clean energy development in rural America, and this topic of combining really good practices at the solar sites. How can we best steward that land, utilize those conservation practices is coming up for us, and we're looking into that. And we have a fact sheet actually coming up that Audrey's been helping us a little bit with on solar grazing. So tell us a little bit about what this practice is and what some of the benefits are.
Yeah, so the practice is really managing at its base, managing vegetation on solar sites, whether that vegetation is mandated through policies or desired via the landowner or the developer. Whatever vegetation is planted under solar, and to encourage healthy plant communities that won't eventually turn into forests. So generally, the idea of solar grazing is to do that management without mechanical mowing and other kind of inputs that you need along with mechanical mowing, such as weed whipping and spraying. And then within solar grazing, there's lots of variance on how we actually get the job done. Some solar grazers graze like, a farmer might on pasture, where they're rotating around, or sometimes continuous grazing on a piece of land that has solar panels above it. And then we at MNL actually have sheep to manage the prairies. So our model is a little different, where we're really using the tool of animals to manage the prairies, and other folks are using the, agricultural and solar land, agrovoltaic land to grow their flocks or herds. But the practice is managing that vegetation.
Perfect. And so what are some of the benefits that make this more desirable than just traditional management with mowing and weed whipping and the use of herbicides at the site?
Yeah, that's my favorite topic. The benefits are really the kind of across the board. Starting out, their environmental benefits are really important and quite huge. From reducing or really increasing the soil health over time and making sure that we're allowing for a diverse plant community to come up, And then reducing erosion, because we have a diverse plant community with lots of roots and healthy, systems underground that kind of hold the soil in place, to, increasing pollinators and the benefits that come along with pollinators. And then also, kind of the ability to manage the whole site with one tool can be really amazing, in the sense that over time, if you're really building that soil health and you're really making sure that animals are managing the pasture, the prairie well, so they're not overgrazing, you're going to have just an increased health overall of that community, and therefore have fewer weeds and trees that are able to kind of come through that grass, because there is that blanket of healthy grasses that you want covering the land. Where, as the other option might be that if we're not supporting that soil health, we're slowly degrading the soil health. More and more bare soil might start appearing on sites over time. So that's the environmental and kind of management benefits. To the grazers, it's a huge benefit to be able to supplement a farm income. This might be an option for somebody to go from having to, from working a 40-hour plus a week job plus farming, to being able to kind of that's kind of one of the better options, I think, and one that we could really move forward and toward. And that ability to grow a flock without land, which of course we all know that a lot of beginning farmers have trouble getting onto land and being able to afford to rent it. And so this might be another really awesome option to get engaged in grazing, even if you don't have that infrastructural support. The other really wonderful thing is for developers. We do have lots of benefits that developers are able to take advantage of, such as those fewer issues over time. They're going to pay less, or developers, or the solar managers, I should say, they're going to pay less for management over time, because we're using a healthy tool, a tool that the environment is meant to have used. Excuse me. Animals are kind of that natural tool. So there's the fewer issues over time. There's a social benefit from it, of just, ensuring that the developer or the solar manager is really demonstrating to the community a certain care for the land on which they are operating, I think is really huge. And we see that across the board. Communities are really excited to have animals in their towns. It helps to bring the folks that live right around the solar farm into the fold and make them feel a little bit more engaged in the system, I believe. Which I think over time really does create a huge social benefit for the developer and solar manager. And then I think getting permits through and kind of working at the paperwork and documentation level, demonstrating pollinator, interest in pollinator health or interest in agrovoltaics in the community, just helps get the permit, helps with solar developers and managers get permitting through a lot faster. Or it can. So those are just a few of the benefits, but there's probably the most important ones.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing those different perspectives. And it's something that we're certainly seeing when we do the research on this, that there's just myriad benefits to, the land, economic opportunities for those grazers, and the benefits for the developer at the site. So we've got a question from Facebook here, and this is what I was going to get to next. So let's talk a little bit about the site. What is needed at the site? And we have a question from Lance on Facebook, and he says, "Do the sheep eat the wires?"
Yeah, I'll start with the wire question because that's a little easier. They don't generally eat the wires. We do go back and forth, and in every once in a while, because there's often a lot of other animals on site, such as groundhogs and things that do eat wires. So sometimes it seems that they do, but in general, no, they don't eat any of the wires. They actually have a much softer impact on the solar sites than most of. Much fewer panels are broken, and issues around wires being cut or things being run into are highly reduced with the sheep. So fewer costs that way too. What we need to make it work is kind of in some ways site specific, of course, as most things are, but I'll kind of give an overreach or chat about what some of the overarching themes are that make it easier to work on solar sites with sheep. Obviously, from the establishment perspective, just making sure that developers are choosing the right forage mixes that meet their goals, whether the goal is to have a pollinator site where you're mob grazing once a year just to manage that thatch for fire reduction, or if the goal is to provide the farmer next door a year-round pasture. That's going to be really different, and making sure you match those seeds to the seed mixes to ensure that you're getting the most out of that possible is kind of one of the number one things to do. And then after that, ensuring that conversations around fencing early on can be had with the developers to make sure that the fencing is down to the ground so that the sheep aren't escaping and the grazer doesn't need to kind of do a bunch of infrastructural support to ensure that the sheep stay in, because that can become quite prohibitive for the grazer and for the solar developer or manager. And then the things that make things a lot nicer, of course, are having access to a well on site where a farmer might be able to just tap into rather than having to haul water. And then, access to the ability to hook up into a 110 or a, typical outlet is really wonderful. And then just making sure that there's shared and understood expectations about what is supposed to be happening on that site with that management. I think often, we have different goals around how the site might be grazed, and just having those conversations kind of upfront about so that the farmer can meet the solar developer and manager's expectations, and so that also the farmer can get some of their needs met. And just making sure that those conversations are had at the beginning and honest, and that understanding that we're all trying together. And I think that if we work as a team, we can really come at this and make sure that solar grazing is a major part of vegetation management under solar fields. Yeah, those are the big ones.
Sorry about that. I was just saying, so we've got here at the beginning of a project, we've got landowners, we've got developers, we've got grazers, all coming together with this goal to meet management of vegetation at the site. So what are some considerations that those parties need to be thinking about in advance? I'm thinking of contracts and those sort of things. What would be your kind of advice or considerations that you would think about for those?
That's a really good question. I'll just drive home again one more time. Making sure you're putting the right seed mix in the ground the first time would be probably the first one. Just getting on board with what type of grazing you want to do, how much contact you want to have is essential. And then beyond that, kind of once you get into the contracts and kind of conversations among different parties, I would say things to really think about are that the sheep are going to manage it differently than it's going to look mowed. Depending on kind of the various different ways you can be managing the prairie or the pasture. They're not going to leave it completely cut perfectly across at the same line the way that a mower might. They are going to, poop all over the site, which is kind of something that I think is important to bring up at the beginning. And they might we have some sheep that our sheep sometimes move stairs around, and they do weird things because there's been animals on a site for 2 weeks. So there's pieces to that of just kind of recognizing that animals are living beings that are going to do their own thing, and trying to set up early on that whose responsibility for those weird animal things, I guess, who's responsible for that. So we take on the responsibility of ensuring that stairs get put back in place, and that areas where there's a lot of techs walking around, we sweep off those areas. And we kind of have created those expectations over time as they've come up, working with the owners. But that's had we been able to have those conversations at the beginning, there would have been less work throughout the time to kind of manage those conversations. And that's one wonderful thing about kind of being at the forefront of something, is you do get to kind of work it out. But to pass that along, I would say just make sure you're having those conversations early on about what sheep are going to do, what they're not going to do. I will say that they do a really great job of eating around areas that weed whips don't even get into. And so they, kind of creating that deeply understood expectation about what's going to happen right at the forefront, from the farmer perspective. And then I think that on the other side, the developers and the owners need to be clear about what their expectations are and what they're looking for, so that the farmer or the grazer can try to meet that. And or say, have the conversation as to why that would be hard or impossible to do. And I think the developer can also kind of come to the I think that it's important to recognize, that there's limitations to how much you can control with animals. I run into a lot not being able to communicate the way that I think a lot of people would prefer, just because I don't know when the sheep will be done a lot of the time. And so kind of having those conversations as well, that being clear on kind of what the whole process will look like, is important. But otherwise, I would say contractually, just making sure that, liability is really zipped up between the whole group, and making sure that for, the farmer and the developer, and neither one is taking on an immense amount of risk, in this system, and making sure that everybody is protected walking into the door.
Is there examples of contracts out there that someone might be able to take a look at?
That's a really good question. I actually can't point to any specific contracts that I would be able to share at this moment, but I might be able to get you some that you could share with the network at some point soon. But yeah, I can speak from experiences that we do run it. We have entered into a number of contracts where we are liable to a certain amount of money if there's damage to the sheep that the sheep cause on the sites. But we're not liable for the possible damage that could happen, just because that would be too much for us to take on.
Yeah. So this word agrovoltaics, you brought it up a little earlier, the combination of agriculture and solar energy. We're hearing a lot more about this, and it's becoming more widespread. And we saw that New Jersey enacted a dual use solar law over the summer that will put into place a 3-year pilot program for sites to combine agriculture and solar to get a tax break. So we see some of these policies coming into place. How widespread do you think that the practice of solar grazing is becoming? And can you maybe give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. It's becoming quite widespread in the sense that it is being people are doing this practice across the US, and across, in other areas of the world, of course, as well. I'm more versed in the US information. So there's people practicing on, over 2,000 or 3,000 acres in California, on a single site, to people, we work with somebody that just grazed, I think a half acre to an acre site in almost downtown DC. So across the board, there's, tons of people doing this, lots of people grazing on sites, and then it's happening across the US. We also, there's a group that's quite like us that operates out of the southeastern part of the United States. And then there is a very big movement for it in the Northeast, where they're doing a lot more pasturing of animals on those sites. And again, I think we're kind of at the forefront of trying to use this tool to manage prairies for pollinator habitat specifically, where a lot of the folks that we work with and, that work alongside with are managing it for the pasture. So again, quite different in how they're doing it, but there's examples of it all over the United States, from, again, that really big example in California to really small spaces. The slightly anecdotally, the space in DC, the site was built to disallow, or in a way that kind of ended up disallowing mowing, because there was not enough space around the panels to maneuver the mower between the panels and the fence. And so essentially they needed to have sheep on site, and we were able to kind of help make that happen. But on the other side, sometimes sheep can get into places that other other management tools wouldn't be able to. But it is happening across the US.
So if someone is interested in getting involved in solar grazing, say there's a beginning farmer out there, someone's doing sheep and they're looking to add this to their operation, what would be kind of their next step in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two things I would say to that are, one, if it's somebody that already owns the land and is talking with a developer to develop their own land into a solar site that they could manage, just, set that up before you've created the contract for them to develop on your land. That write into it that you are the manager of the vegetation, and you can create the vegetation management plan at that time using sheep, if you'd like to. That's one way to go about it. If you're not somebody that owns land and you have animals, I would say generally kind of going through a conglomerate like us, where we kind of have a lot of connections within the solar world, or there's a group called ASGA that is based in the Northeast, but they are trying to become a little bit more widespread throughout the US, and succeeding. That's a really great group to get really networked with and start chatting. Farmers and grazers across the board at that group are very interested in how to advance the practice of solar grazing and want to support one another across the board. The other thing, yeah, I would say probably kind of just hooking in with a group that's kind of already doing it and seeing if you can kind of join. You could always owner as well. That tends to seem to be a little bit harder for folks.
Thanks for that. Are there any other resources you would like people to be aware of? So you mentioned ASGA, that's the American Solar Grazing Association. I think I have it right there. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks for spelling it out. I totally forgot to.
Yeah, I think they have a really great website with a lot of resources on it, but are there others that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I would just, there are a lot. I am kind of don't have anybody specifically to point to in terms of another group like ASGA per se, but I would say just watching and learning from solar grazers that are out there. Again, there are plenty of people doing it and they're sharing a lot about what they're doing. So it's not hard to find on Instagram or on other platforms like that. Typing it into Google and starting to noodle around is a really great way. The only other kind of site that I would say I find really interesting, just because it kind of provides a nice thought experiment as to what agrovoltaics could really look like, is NREL's Inspire. NREL is the National Research Energy Lab, I believe, and their Inspire project is a research project around how we co-locate these offerings of solar and agriculture. And so they have some really fun stuff on their website, that's from vegetable farming between the rows, to having honeybees on site, to grazing, and all sorts of different ways of kind of thinking about agrovoltaics. And I would say that's a really cool one to start there as well.
Perfect. So we will plan to drop those resources into the comments under this story. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up today?
I just want to say thanks for having me here. It's been really lovely to work with you on a number of projects, and I'm really excited about what the Center for Rural Affairs is doing to support folks across America, and particularly in the Midwest right now. And yeah, anything that we can do at MNL to be involved in helping create a healthy future for the earth and for humans we'd love to be a part of.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and your expertise with us today, and for joining us. And we love that you are interested in helping us create this message, and for sharing this the solar grazing opportunity today. So thank you, Audrey, and thank you everybody for joining us today, and feel free to reach out to us afterwards if you have additional questions.
Thanks, Heidi.